So inflammation. So inflammation is actually a good guy in a lot of ways. So, our body is designed to communicate with us, to let us know when something's working or not working. And inflammation is one of the ways that that happens. So it's actually a very normal protective process. We want that to happen in the body. And so I just put some familiar, these are things that we're all familiar with. A headache, maybe after a night of maybe too much alcohol or things like that. That's the body's way of communicating with us. Pain after trauma. So if you're hanging a picture and you hit your thumb with a hammer, it's going to get inflamed, right? And that's how it should be. The body should be able to communicate with you that ideally you shouldn't hit your thumb with a hammer, right? It has a feedback system. Cuts are probably one of our best examples of that. If you slice your finger when you're cooking, you'll notice that it actually gets red, which is for a reason. It gets inflamed. The purpose is the body is trying to resolve it and heal it. And then certainly fever is another, so there's a little controversy, right? In general, in our modern world, we try to kill fevers, right? Thinking we got to get that fever down, and certainly there are indications for that, but in general, a fever is the body's way of inflaming in a way to sort of cook the germs, right? To try to get rid of them. And then certainly muscle aches after exertion. So if you're a weekend warrior, or you decide one day you're going to do your whole garden, the next day you're going to be slightly inflamed because you've overexerted. So that's sort of the foundation. So really, what is inflammation? Again, it's really the body's normal response to two major things: foreign invaders, and it's really a response to repair injury. So when your body senses, and this is really the beauty of the body, so when your body senses a foreign invader, it sends a cascade of white blood cells, so immune cells, and special chemicals called cytokines that are kind of mobilized to come to really create that repair. And foreign invaders could be bacteria, bugs. So bugs can be, Lyme is a bug, right? Any kind of viruses, or an injury could be a trauma, infection, toxin. So we're I think most people are familiar with those two processes. So now the body has had some sort of an injury, some sort of a trauma. It brings in these guys to clean up, which is what we would want. The challenge comes when we have inflammation as a bad guy. And what that means is chronic inflammation. So inflammation that doesn't go away, where it retains for over time. So this happens when either an injury continues. So if you were to hammer your thumb every single day, right, that's a chronic inflammatory process. Or if there's something that's assaulting the body on a regular basis, that becomes chronic. So most chronic diseases that we face today are rooted or linked to excessive or this persistent inflammation, right? So it's that good, healthy process gone on way too long, and for some reason it doesn't turn off, and that's really sort of the conundrum of inflammation. So really, if I were to sum up my talk in 3 sentences, it might be this next bullet. So the causes of chronic inflammation are multiple, and for many people result from a combination of nutritional imbalances, too much of something, too little of something, environmental toxins, so that can be anything from the chemicals in the air to things in our homes, things we put on our bodies, and then chronic stress. It's a big factor for inflammation, and then pathogens, bugs, that we would take into our system. So what happens when we're chronically inflamed? And this is just one example, right? So these are some of the common disorders, and as you look at that list, you may actually have a diagnosis of one of those. You may know someone, you may know somebody who has more than one. And we can really tie all of that back to this chronic inflammatory state. So most people will make that association with things that have itis at the name, right? Some people think arthritis is inflammation, but most people don't think of hypertension or hyperlipidemia, right, which is elevated lipids or high cholesterol. Most people don't think of that, but in a sense, it still is inflammation. It's that reactive process going on too long. So, some of the major things we connected to certainly are heart disease, cancer, diabetes, dementia has rooted in inflammation. So it's probably one of the most biggest contributors to obesity, and we'll talk about that a little bit longer. But when we carry body fat, we used to think we just carried it. It came for the ride, we didn't like it, it made us slower to walk. But what we now know is fat is what we call exocrine. So it actually excretes some of these little inflammatory molecules. So it's kind of like a dog chasing its tail. So when you're in that state, often there's other health disorders, but then itself kind of keeps promoting that chronic inflammation. So if we think about that, how do we handle or treat it? And this probably could be a talk in itself. So we're kind of think of sort of two philosophies here. So the pharmacological conventional medicine focuses more on symptoms, and you'll see that in your when you have your handouts. I included something which we'll talk about is what we call the functional medicine tree, the symptoms being the leads and really having to look more at the roots. So conventional now, I'm not in any way indicating that there are not times and places where you need pharmacological intervention. It's a brilliant thing that we have some medicines, but sometimes when we have these chronic conditions, people feel like they're at a point where it's not helping, right? Or they have to keep upping medication and they still feel like I'm inflamed, it isn't mediating it. So functional medicine works upstream to say, why? Why is this body so chronically inflamed? Why does somebody have diabetes and arthritis or fibromyalgia? Why is all of those inflammatory processes happening all at once? How did that body get so out of balance? And that's really the philosophy that I'm always looking at. So inflammation can actually be dampened by avoiding exposures and changing the mediators with lifestyle and diet. So in many ways, you are really in the driver's seat there. Now, sometimes that's the good news, and sometimes that's the bad news, right? So this is an example. So the functional medicine approach says we really need to get to the root cause. So you see here, again, we could talk about all of these things on the bottom here that help feed these roots, that grow that tree, so to say, that could be named any one of those or multiple disorders. All of those factors. So, inflammation itself, stress, poor diet, toxins, lack of sleep. Huge problem, right? Sleep is a big issue. It's a big factor for imbalances in the body. Poor relationships, toxic relationships, stressful relationships, toxic thought, lack of exercise, genetics. So we're hearing more and more about genetics, right? Genetic predispositions, poor digestion. So all of those things are really the seat of inflammation. So if we look at this, that we say you're in the driver's seat, often the behaviors that got you into this inflammatory state, if we start reversing them, we can back out of it. Now, it's not to say, or it's not my suggestion that means like, oh, I don't need to take my medication anymore, I'm just going to change my diet. No, that's not really what we're talking about, but we're saying that so much of what our lifestyle includes can make such a huge difference. So by making changes, often people will start to feel better. So we're just going to highlight some of these things that really put our body in this pro-inflammatory state. So these are things that really promote inflammation. And I'm going to say maybe that first one might be one of the highest ones, right? So sugar is very tricky. It seduces us. We're addicted to it. We love it. We know it's not good for us. But what we know is that it can be immunosuppressive when we eat it for up to 2 to 4 hours, depending on how much. So that means if I have a big sugary meal, basically my immune system's on vacation for a couple of hours. Whatever comes in, it's off the job, right? So that's how we might get a bug. We might break down our immune system that then now we're in an inflamed state. Now the sugar itself is pro-inflammatory because sugar, what it really does in a way is, it's called glycation or oxidation. It really rusts us. It's very, if you ever have an old swing set that you had in your backyard from years ago and those pipes sit out and over time it gets really rusty from the air, the same thing happens in a sense when we eat a lot of sugar. Now some of you may have yourself or had a family member who's had a test done to measure blood sugar levels that's called hemoglobin A1C. Does anybody know about that test? Anybody heard of that test? What that's really measuring is how sugary are your red blood cells. Because red blood cells have a short life, so it's looking at the red blood cells and saying, have they been washed in sugar all day long? Are they a little bit washed in sugar or a lot? So that's really what we're looking at, that same idea, this oxidation. Poor fat foods. Now, most of you are probably starting to hear now a trend shifting to be pro-fat, right? We used to be low fat, no fat, so probably some of you remember Snackwell cookies. They were a big favorite, right? Snackwells, you could eat as many as you wanted, right? Because they had no fat in them. But then we learned that Snackwell cookies had a lot of sugar in them, right? There were a lot of processed carbohydrate. So when we want to look at fats, we have to look at good fats versus poor fats. So I think most people have heard some reference to taking out hydrogenated fats or partially hydrogenated fats. Like most people have a sense, right, of looking at that. So that one we know is a fat. They basically take something that's liquid and they literally hydrogenate it. They pump it with a lot of hydrogen to change the bonds, right? So fats are these long chain molecules. They change the way that fat is bonded together and it turns into a solid. When we know we do that, the body doesn't like that. So the body doesn't usually handle things that have been altered, foods that have been altered differently than how nature brought it to us. So things that are also in this list now are things like canola oil. Canola oil is a very processed oil, which, just as a little fun fact, is actually named because it was a Canada oil. That's how it's got its name, right? Canola. But it's kind of a sliced and diced and boiled and bleached kind of a fat. So it's not optimal. It's a very processed fat. Corn oil, not a great fat, right? A lot of GMO corn, a lot of pesticides, very hard to get organic corn. A soybean oil, very inferior quality fat. Those are all harder on the body. So we'll talk, more as we go on of the or the anti-inflammatory fats. But it kind of makes sense. The body's pretty smart. I had a really inspired professor when I was taking my master's program who used to, he loved to throw out these thought-provoking questions, and he used to say to us, everything gets this name as a disease. There's this disease and this disease. Maybe it's actually not a disease, but a perfect response that the body's giving to the data it's been given. What else could it do but get out of balance because we're giving bad data, right? We're giving poor and inferior foods. Food allergens can be very, very connected to systemic inflammation. So gluten and dairy probably top the list, but there are others. Now that doesn't mean every person should not eat gluten and should not eat dairy, but if you're a person who has a lot of inflammatory process, that you're, again, maybe you have thyroid issues or autoimmune issues, that's probably the first place we're going to look. So if we think about the way our body handles these allergens, so our immune system is very smart. When it sets its sight on something that it feels is foreign, it sets its sight on it, right? So if you eat a teaspoon or a cup, it doesn't matter. It goes like, oh, I don't like that guy. So every time he comes in, I'm going to try to go after it. So we know, just like the example when we cut our finger in the kitchen, we get that inflammatory response to repair. In a sense, that's what happens when we eat a food that's an allergen. It's like a response that the immune system starts going after food. So just like the example where we talked about sugar, putting your immune system on holiday for a couple hours, in a sense, you've got your immune system now working on food. probably not going to be on the job the way we want it to if it's getting a lot of reactive foods. Now, when we have this chronic response to food, the body forms what are called immune complexes. It's kind of like a combination of cells that kind of get blocked and held there, and so over time it creates a bit of an immune problem. So these are really three basic things that we can think of with food that can be very pro-inflammatory. Also, foods that promote bacteria overgrowth in the small intestine. So some of you may have had some experience with some integrated or functional doctors. You may be hearing a little bit more about something called SIBO. Has anybody heard of SIBO? S-I-B-O? Yeah, a couple of people. So that's called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. It's a bit of a phenomenon now we're seeing more and more of. Its most classic symptom is extreme bloating after eating, even eating good foods. And so what we know is that in our immune system, our bacteria are supposed to be in our large gut, right? Not in our small intestine. When we eat a lot of, there's that sugar again, sugar, white things, really starchy, we start to get bugs in our upper gut. That creates a bit of a problem. On the flip side of that, when we're eating simple things, we're often avoiding fibers. So fibers are so important, not only to help us pull toxins, but they actually help us make our good bacteria. So the more whole real foods we have, the more fiber we're going to have. And then this one is always really interesting. So typically in the United States, we don't have a big problem with people being malnourished, right? We tend to think of that more third world issues. But we can see this happen, that people actually don't have enough of what we call phytonutrients. So phytonutrients are the really good nutrients that come from the colors in fruits and vegetables. So I recently did a lot of newsletters. Some of you may get my newsletter looking at the different colors of food and why they're so important. So that's really this phytonutrient piece. So fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds. So when we don't have enough of that, that can really create much more of a pro-inflammatory state. So I always like to have a little humor in the middle. So the body's very smart, right? So this is like swelling, Babcock. It's our body's way of telling us that something's wrong. But if you insist on staying in the game, hey, it's your elbow, right? So some of us can override our body's messages. And then the humongo meal comes with your choice of two sides: heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, or obesity. So, you know, the power, that's where you're in the driver's seat, right? So some of those choices we're making, we're starting to see that. I don't know how well restaurants would do if they actually told us that, right? So besides food, we just talked a lot about how food can create inflammation. And there are other things that create inflammation. So insufficient exercise. So we talked a little bit about fat tissue and how it's pro-inflammatory. It's actually exocrine, right? It secretes these inflammatory molecules. And we know that when we increase muscle mass, that really helps us in lots of ways. So lean muscle mass is in itself almost its own detoxifier. It also, when we build muscle, we increase the insulin receptors in our body, and that means we handle sugar better. Now, that doesn't mean if you exercise a lot that you then can proportionally up your sugar. It just means even the good sugar that you might get from fruit or from complex carbohydrates is assimilated very quickly. And that's where, if we think back to the hemoglobin A1C, right, where we're measuring how sugary your body is, that's where we see those numbers go down, right, because the body has a really good capacity to absorb glucose and sugars. So vitamin D deficiency, interestingly enough, is very common. It's even common in Florida. It's not just those of us who live in the Northeast. How many of you had your vitamin D levels checked? Yeah, so most people, right? We're starting to look at that. From a functional medicine perspective, we like the number a little higher than the conventional. So for an adult female conventional, 30 is considered sufficient. We think maybe 55 is probably better. What we know now is really that vitamin D is really more of a hormone than a vitamin, right? It has a lot of jobs. It's probably one of really the key players. So it talks about osteoarthritis here, and also for bone health. we used to think calcium was the star of the show. Probably calcium is more the supporting cast. Vitamin D is really a key part of that. And we know that causes inflammation. So sometimes simply adding a vitamin D supplement can make a huge difference in reducing that inflammation. So fatty acid imbalances, so insufficiencies of omega-3 and omega-6 fats. So we talked a little bit about pro-inflammatory fats. So most of us tend to eat more omega-6 fats. So if we made a general, olive oil falls into that category, which is very protective. But those bad fats that we talked about often show up, right, in most of our packaged goods, or it's the one we find most commonly because they're a very affordable resource, right? People, they always like to put them in things. But omega-3 fats are what we know are the more anti-inflammatory, right? We'll talk more about those. But when those naturally have an ability to manage the inflammatory process in the body to support it, that what we'll call that resolution. So we talked about when things are running well, it resolves quickly. When things get stalled, or when the body has so many pro-inflammatory inputs, it doesn't resolve. And these things will help with that resolution. Okay, so vitamin and mineral deficiency. So when we eat a very processed diet, we often find that people can be deficient. And I would say magnesium, I would agree clinically that I've seen that is probably one of the most common. Magnesium has somewhere around 300 jobs in the body, and when that's deficient, it can affect a lot of systems. What's so brilliant about the body's biochemistry, and some of you may remember this from either high school or university, biology, or maybe you took some biochemistry. The body has so many different systems and pathways, and they basically work with what are called cofactors or helpers. So the body may move through a process of detox. It might get to step 1 and it might need B6. And then it might get to step 4 and it may need magnesium. So when we have deficiencies, those processes are slower to move, and so we find that sometimes just by supplementing, even just a basic multivitamin, all of a sudden everything moves a little more quickly. Now, from a dietary standpoint, of course, our most famous support for that are vegetables. So I'm going to do a minimum of 3 commercials for a vegetable. I always do that in every session, so here's my first one. So vitamins and minerals are abundant in fruits and vegetables, and I'll probably put a bigger emphasis on vegetables. They just naturally have minerals and vitamins galore. So the more we eat of those, the better we're going to support our whole body system, not the least of which is this environment of inflammation. So xenobiotic and toxic accumulation. So while it is nonspecific, it can definitely lead to inflammation in the body. So if we think of, an example of even heavy metals. So there's some research, and it can vary from person to person, but the metals that come in amalgams, right? The old-fashioned silver fillings, there's mercury in those, and mercury is a toxin, right? So it's like that, if that toxin is being leached into the body, for example, in some people, that's very pro-inflammatory, right? The body's just going, oh, gosh, this isn't supposed to be here. How can I manage this? I got to get this out somehow. And then I would say this one definitely could be a lecture in itself: emotional stress and toxic relationships. So stress, oh my gosh, it casts such a big net over everything, right? And everyone seems to be so stressed. It's kind of everyone's mantra, right? We all, oh, I'm so busy, I'm so stressed, I'm so stressed. And, I think that most of you, I had a grandfather who smoked unfiltered Camel cigarettes, ate like piles of bacon for breakfast, didn't eat well at all, loved his sugar, his cakes, his candy. But let me tell you, he was not stressed about one thing. He could care less what people thought of him. And we all know that story, right? We've all got that one person like, that doesn't make sense. Like, they're living kind of hard and they seem to do well. I mean, he lived, well into his 80s, right? So
having said that, there are a handful of people who get really good genes and seem to not be overly stressed, but I don't find that to be the majority. So stress is one of those moving pieces that we can probably really affect so much in the body. You know, if we think of stress, if we just think of our nervous system, right? If we just think of a basic review of our nervous system. So it primarily has two parts. So the sympathetic nervous system, most people know that as the fight or flight system, or the parasympathetic. We sometimes call that the rest and digest system. So if we think primally that I'm a caveman and I'm being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, at that moment, the body is brilliant, right? It takes chemicals, gives you that shot of adrenaline. It takes all of your energy, drives it right into your muscles to say, like, go, right? To protect you for survival. Now, I would imagine at the end of that, either you got eaten or you didn't, right? And I think if you made it back to the cave, I'm not convinced people were telling, well, wait till the tiger came this close. I think they lived like, whew, I'm good, let's have dinner, right? So that's a brilliant system the body's designed. And some of you may even know these like wild stories where, like, particularly moms, like, you know, the 80-pound rock rolls on the kid and somehow the mom picks the rock up, right? That's sympathetic, right? That's like, oh gosh, this is a really acute, serious situation I have to manage. The parasympathetic is the other one. That's everything is well, we're on vacation, life is good, that's the big exhale. The challenge comes for most of us in our modern life that we've always got a tiger on our tail, right? We're always feeling pressured. We don't have enough time. We didn't get this done. So what happens with your body is it doesn't really know the difference between the actual tiger and the tiger movie that's running in your head. So now we have a problem because most of us are sitting. So what happens to all those chemicals? What happens to that whole process? Now I'm sitting in my chair imagining the tiger's chasing me. All those same chemicals are excreted and they become inflammatory. The other part of that that's really important to note is that all of the core functions, what I sometimes think of as the housekeeping of the body, the digestion, elimination, sleep, are not part of that sympathetic system. So I always think the body is saying, you know, we've all done this, like, I'm really stressed, I have a deadline at work, and we're eating, trying to, like, get, and I always think the body's going, like, if we're in an emergency, why are we eating? Shouldn't we be running? Like, I don't get this. Why are you eating right now, right?
Right.
So the fact is that that's across of the system. So when we're always in that state, it can affect digestion. It can affect, so half of the population has GERD, right? Reflux. Everybody's on this reflux. So maybe it's because I'm so stressed and I'm eating that I can't digest my food. This is just one theory, right? To say that this impact of stress is really powerful. So when that happens day after day after day, you fold in poor diet, not sleeping, maybe some genetic tendencies, maybe you have a history of things, it kind of makes sense, right? Why the body would just be like, I'm out, man. We're done. This is too much. I can't take all this input. So I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but that's a really important one, and I often will share with my clients, it's probably the one people adopt last, right? Changing food sometimes seems a little easier, but getting that connection to managing stress, turning off your screen, like dialing it down, is a huge help for your health and powerful way to reduce that inflammation. So, a change in thinking. So, the high-carb diet I put you on 20 years ago gave you diabetes, high blood pressure, and heart disease. Oops. So, we talked about that a little bit with, you know, relative to when we were on the low-fat craze, right? So now we're hearing more about the high good fats, but we know that our understanding of how diet and lifestyle affects our health has really come full circle. And I can say from a functional medicine perspective that one of the things that was very appealing to me, I have a long history in integrated medicine, but one of the factors that's so appealing to me about this perspective is that the patient's in the driver's seat, right? The patient or client is at the center of this harnessing all these tools to say, like, you can really start to take charge again. So, we'll talk a little bit more about the diet and inflammation. So, your diet can either contribute to inflammation or reduce it. So, we talked about the bad fats, the trans fats, packaged foods. So, in general, when we heat foods to high temperatures, like frying things, probably not great, right? Most fats don't tend to like that very much. Fats tend to oxidize, or some people think certain fats, really delicate fats, can become even rancid at high temperatures. So that's considered a very pro-inflammatory food. Now, can you do that once in a while if you have a favorite food? Sure. But if you're the person who always gets the fries 2 and 3 times a week, that's probably going to be inflammatory for your body. The refined sugars, and this, I think what's important to note is there's a lot of sweeteners out there, right? And we keep making new sweeteners because we all like the sweet taste. So in general, what I would say is you want to try to reduce sweet in whatever form it comes in, because there's been a lot of research done recently about sugar and the power of sugar. Some of you may have seen some of these reports. There's a doctor, I want to say he's maybe Yale or Harvard. His name is David Lustig, and he's done a lot of research with sugar and rats. And this is a true story. They gave rats a choice between cocaine and Oreo cookies, and they choose Oreo cookies, and they break them open and eat the frosting first. And I'm not making that up. So that's true. So it's just to say, because sometimes I have clients that say, oh, I'm like, oh, I don't know what's the matter with me. I'm just such a weakling. I can't seem to resist. Well, it's very addictive, sugar. It gets a hold of us, right? So reducing those, and even the artificial sweeteners. So there's things like Splenda out there now, so I might be stepping on a couple toes here, but Splenda is a fake food. It's not real. It's a chemical. And there's some research, I've read some things that it may have started as a pesticide. It's not a good choice, right? Because it's a chemical. And what we know is when we put chemicals in the body doesn't know what to do with that, right? And so it tries to manage that. So Truvia. How many people know about Truvia? So Truvia isn't stevia, because it would be called stevia. So they've messed with stevia, because stevia is a plant, right? You can't put a trademark on a plant, so they've turned it around. So honestly, I would rather, if somebody's going to do something, they use a little bit of raw cane sugar. It's the real deal. It comes from a plant. There's nothing then to use some of these artificial things. And
how about xylitol?
Xylitol is a sugar alcohol. Some people do okay with xylitol. Some people who have gut issues find that it can bloat them a little bit because it's a sugar alcohol. I think it's probably a reasonable choice, but in the broad stroke, or I'll say in the broad stroke, I always think trying to train our palate away from a lot of sweet is good, but that can be a reasonable. There's actually some research that xylitol gum can actually be helpful post-prandial, after you eat, to actually clear some of the bacteria right from the mouth for dental health, to improve dental health. But that's probably reasonable. Holy stevia is probably reasonable. Maybe a little raw honey. I mean, there's some that are on the periphery that you can use as what I call more recreational foods than every single day at every single meal. That's harder on the body. So we have to really watch that. And I know that's really hard to do because, most of our events are surrounded by some sort of treats, right? That's how we celebrate every holiday,
Do you also include the sugars in sweet fruit like watermelon or raisins in that?
Yeah, so when you metabolize a fruit or a carbohydrate, with the exception of veg, if you say brown rice, or we'll use the example of raisins, or let's say grapes, when you metabolize it, it still becomes glucose. And the body doesn't have the ability to say, oh, that came from a grape, we're good, I'm okay with that glucose. If it came from a cookie, I probably would have an issue with it. So it is important to look. So most people eat more fruits easily than vegetables. right? Because it's a little hard to grab a cucumber and walk out the door, right? Bananas are easy to do that with, or apples. So I think you do have to be mindful of fruit and dried fruit, because it still is that sweet taste. So, yeah, so, however, if you're a person who says, listen, I love chocolate chip cookies, and now I eat apples and raisins, I'm probably going to say great change, right? So I think it depends on your circumstances, but sugar is sugar. And, you know, probably for most adults, 3 fruits a day is probably, like if I gave a general, you know, sort of parameter, is probably enough. As I say, most people aren't short on fruit. It's usually the vegetables that we're trying to increase. So processed meats and meat products. So, you know, there's some fine lines here, because if anyone here has actually been a client of mine, you know that I probably gave you the option of using like a company like Applegate Farms, who does make some cleaner cold cuts. So, you know, sometimes we have to try to find a bit of a balance. But one thing that we know is that the processed meats that have a lot of the additives in it, the colors, those are the things you want to stay away from. If you're a person who says, listen, I try to get the cleanest turkey breast I can get, you know, at the deli, that works for me, that's probably a reasonable choice. It's really the more processed things. And then red meat also comes up a lot. So is red meat good? Is red meat bad? It depends on the person. What we do know about red meat is just the way we've described what can happen to a human when they eat too much sugar or starch. The same thing is true with a cow. So a cow that is fed corn changes the cow. It becomes more acidic. His whole fat structure changes. And the cow that's fed grass, it's a very different cow. The meat is completely different. I had the fortune many years ago to know a farmer when I lived in Canada who was a real trend. He was way ahead of this. I mean, I'm talking 15 years ahead of this sort of grass-fed. And he had an objection when people would, even in the organic world, when as long as a cow got organic corn, it could be certified organic. And he used to say, no, that's not what cows eat. They eat grass. So he created a whole co-op where he taught farmers how to grow the grass to feed the cows, and then he would buy those cows back. So that we know is that they're very different. Now, there's certainly controversy of the sustainability of it. There's definitely factors. So I think trying to get the cleaner meat, maybe we eat less of it, is probably a good compromise there. But we know that more factory, you know, those mass production meat, probably not ideal in red meat. So now we'll go to the other side of the fence. So, you know, from a nutritional perspective, for me, it's always 2 sides of the coin. It's important to say, what are we taking out? But if we want to have our glass half full, we want to think, what are we adding in? So, fruits and vegetables, we're too commercial. So, vegetables, the more, the merrier. So, if you go on to, there's a USDA, or I can't remember, it's one of the government websites, they actually say 7 to 10 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. And I think they're very conservative about food. So, you know, 5 or 6 is probably a great target. And, you know, the joke I always say to clients is I have yet to meet someone who eats too many vegetables. I never have had to say, hey, that is just too much broccoli. Nobody needs that much broccoli, right? So it's finding those ways to add more vegetables. They are the rock stars, the rap stars, the hip hop stars, whatever, you know, language it relates to you. They are just a really important part. A plant-based basis in any diet really promotes detox, and it promotes good immune system, and it's anti-inflammatory. So we kind of can't say enough about that. And, you know, we've listed here some of the things, antioxidants. Most people will know the blueberry farmers have done a good job, right? Most of us know we eat our blueberries for antioxidants. So what antioxidants do is they manage what we just talked about, which was oxidation, or that rusting process. So an antioxidant is sort of like, you know, in World War II, the kamikaze pilots that sacrificed themselves. That's really what an antioxidant does. It goes in and it grabs that oxidized molecule and neutralizes it. So if we have a combination of reducing these oxidative inputs and bringing in antioxidants, we're probably a little ahead of the game, right? So that's why that's so important. Bioflavonoids, so quercetin, Some of you may have heard of quercetin. Some people take it for allergies. Quercetin actually breaks up mast cell complexes, what we talked about previously with food allergies, right? So quercetin can be found in a number of fruits and vegetables, and then fiber. So we talked about what happens with low fiber, so by bringing in vegetables we get a lot of fiber. So there's a lot of talk about our microbiome. People started to hear about that. It's been on major magazines. It's really talking about the flora, or the bugs in our gut. So we have 3 trillion, with a T, bacteria that live in our gut. We actually have more bacteria than we have cells in our body. So we're kind of just a big petri dish in a way, right? We're a lot of bacteria. So we know about probiotics. So we know often we see yogurt labels talk about probiotics, adding these probiotics to our food. So the way our body makes our good bugs, which is our immune system, our defense, is by the fermentation of those fibers. So the more fiber we have, the more good bacteria we have. So it's just sort of another bonus. Garlic is a great anti-inflammatory food. It's also a great detox food. It contains what's called sulfur. Helps really support detoxification and anti-inflammatories. Good research about heart disease and things with garlic, so some of you may even take that. Green tea, very anti-inflammatory. We actually have some wonderful green tea here. So really powerful. Tons of research is done on green tea as a source of anti-inflammatory molecules. It does have caffeine in it. So the challenge comes if you are a person who's sensitive to caffeine. So that's kind of on an individual basis, but there's also been good research about coffee recently, but if we stay in the green tea world, if you tolerate the caffeine and it doesn't create sleep issues, I'd say it's a good, to have a good cup of good quality green tea a day is probably a really good anti-inflammatory.
Doesn't matter if it's hot or cold.
Doesn't matter if it's hot or cold. Quality makes a difference. The tea we have here, just incidentally, we were able to get it tested, and it's really high and a lot of good, those good healing molecules. So, but yes.
I'm sorry. Include my slip.
Do you want to go back?
Yeah, sorry, I wanted to.
Sure.
What is pyridine?
That's just another limonene. They're what we call phytonutrients. So they're healthy molecules, nutrients that come in vegetables.
Oh.
So limonene is one that most people recognize, right? Because it looks like lemon. Somebody else have a question?
Thank you.
Green tea.
Yes.
Decaf green tea?
Yeah, there's some different things about that. I've read both. I've read that it's fine, and then I've read maybe we lose something when we take the caffeine out. If I had to lay my bets, if I had a good quality decaf, I'd probably go for it, particularly if it's set in, some other really good interventions that are anti-inflammatory.
So what's caffeine doing that you're saying is good?
I think because when green tea, it's like a whole food when it has its caffeine in it,
Okay.
right? So once we do that, we alter it a little bit.
Gotcha.
Is garlic acceptable if it is roasted garlic?
That's a really good question. Roasting is a good question,
It is to
right?
my palate.
So roasting, barbecuing, grilling, right? We're in that season. Really creates what AGEs, right? Advanced glycation end products. When we actually blacken something, not so great for our system. So I think that the key for that, I think, is to set it in a larger environment of having it other ways. Try not to roast it till it's black. Can you slow roast it, things like that. I think at the end of the day, trying to get those different foods in is what's important. And so sometimes we have to choose our battles a little bit with that. Yeah.
If you add milk to green tea, are you wasting your time drinking the green tea?
Got a couple answers over here. Right. It really depends on the person. So dairy's not the devil, so to say. It's problematic for a lot of people. So it's hard to answer that in a broad stroke. If you had organic a good maybe local organic milk might be a little more positive, might give you some more nutrients, but I think it really depends on the person.
This is really quick about the green tea. I don't mean to get...
Yeah.
What is the green tea that you have that tested so well? What brand?
It's actually something, Ayala can probably answer that a little easier than I can.
If I'm going to give up
So-
coffee for green tea, it's got to be the good.
Oh, this is the real deal, yes.
So, many years ago, so probably close to 20 years ago, my older brother was going to university in Taiwan. And my mother, who founded our older practice many years ago, had asked him to send us a box of some green tea samples. And so he and one of his very close friends, who's native Taiwanese, went and took a tour of all the rainforest tea farms in Taiwan, which is where a lot of the oolong tea comes from in the world. And they sent us a box of like probably 100 samples. And we couldn't tell the difference, obviously, because we don't speak Chinese or read Chinese. But what we did was we tested it in our own sort of manual way, in the sort of work that we do. And we tested it on, our community of clients, on our families, on our friends. We had people drink it. And we ended up choosing a tea that was sort of middle of the range as far as price goes. It wasn't the most expensive, it wasn't the least expensive, but it was by far the one that felt the strongest as far as the benefits that people were experiencing over the months of drinking it, as far as, let's say, an energetic quality that we were picking up. It just felt really good. And we used it for several years. And then one of our very close friends from Israel, who is a plant pathologist, was visiting. He was doing a sabbatical at Rutgers for the year. And he came by and he visited us, and we gave him a bag of green tea as a hello gift. And we asked him if he wouldn't mind analyzing it in his lab. And what he did not know, which, serendipity is always so interesting, that Rutgers was the premier green tea research center for the country for 30 years, which was very cool. So he tested the tea, and he was so shocked by the results, because we had told him how we chose it out of multiple, that he retested it 5 times with his team of PhD plant pathologists. And it came out that it had 5 times the amount of phytophenols, antioxidants in it than any other tea they tested in the history of the lab. It was super cool. So, of course, it led
Did Sharon
to...
know her stuff or what?
Yeah, it was good stuff. So we, my brother's friend, this of course was many years ago when he helped us find this, he ended up opening up a tea business years later. And so over the years he supported us in importing this tea directly from the farm. And it's, they don't have organic certifications in Taiwan in that capacity, but it's a very natural tea farm. It comes straight from there. Of course, it gets dehydrated. It's a loose leaf green tea. So you end up taking like a quarter teaspoon of these little pellets, and you put it in hot water for 3 to 5 minutes to steep. The leaves open up, and you drink it. And
you don't strain it or anything?
You can. You certainly don't have to. It's not going to hurt you. It's just not so convenient to drink that way. Some people use a French press or a tea ball. But what's wonderful about the leaves is they keep their medicinal properties up to 24 hours. So you can keep reusing the same leaves all day. And then, the leaves end up lasting for a long time. You just want to keep it away from like oxygen and direct sunlight. So you keep it in like an airtight container. It doesn't have to be refrigerated, but some people keep it refrigerated, and it's super good quality.
So where do you buy it? Here?
We sell it here. We also sell it on our website.
Okay.
And on the website you can actually see the report from Rutgers Lab.
No,
Yeah.
So I can find it easy.
Yeah, very easily.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. What I got?
So it might be worth the swap then, eh?
Yeah.
Okay, so more things, good things are herbs and spices. So that also makes food interesting, right? So one people's like, oh, it's boring, steamed vegetables are boring, I need sauces, I need flavor. Well, herbs and spices are the way that you create flavor. And, we're seeing more like locally in West Hartford, we have a spice store, right? So, maybe you just go in, and sometimes I do that, and it's like, oh, this smells nice. How would this be to add to my food? And, sometimes it can give things a little extra flavor, but of course the bonus is that there's so many nutrients in those spices, a lot of anti-inflammatory spices, turmeric being probably sort of the star right now, right? Curcumin, some of you may even take supplements with that. So much research being done for cancer and all kinds of inflammatory processes. So that's a great one to add. Oregano, holy basil, rosemary. So just experimenting with all of them. They all kind of have their own the imprint of benefits.
Where do you get holy basil? Do you just buy that on Sundays, or?
Holy basil is actually an adaptogen. It's actually an herb that sometimes people take as a supplement. That's very good for the nervous system. So, yes.
Excuse me, I have recently heard, but I can't remember what I heard, about black pepper and the value of like black pepper, not only cayenne, but just plain old black pepper. Do you know anything about that?
I haven't heard anything recent about
I
it.
wish I remember what I heard.
Nature shared it in the early 80s. She said black pepper is 14 times worse for your liver than alcohol is.
Oh,
But your
cayenne and those are fine.
Okay,
Interesting. Arizona. Okay,
Well,
thank
what's also so interesting about that is, and that may in fact remain to be true, but what we learn all the time is what we don't know, right? We start learning things because we don't even know. I think I want to say in an almond there's like 12 or 14 flavonoids. We don't even know what they are, right? So we're starting to learn about these layers in our food that can in fact be true, and sometimes now when we have some different techniques, we maybe learn there's some cases, or maybe it's where it comes from or how it's processed. So there's probably, space for all of that,
Because I have heard it was a positive.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I think it was nothing.
Yeah, so I think there's, sort of lots of those things that we find. So then, if we think of essential fatty acids, these are the omega-3 fats. So, certainly salmon, wild salmon, again, what we're starting to see. So wild is optimal, but, some of you may hear that there's maybe an issue of sustainability, right? How many salmon could we possibly have? So we are starting to see a trend where people are starting to do sustainable farming, right? Doing fish in a sustainable way. That's sort of a bridge between the very unhealthy farmed fish, right? So that are fed a lot of growth hormones and treated really poorly and, made to grow really quickly, and maybe something that's healthy but that we can do to sort of support the demand. Sardines, anchovies. Sardines are usually, in my experience, either you're in or you're out. I don't get too much maybe on a sardine, right? But those are great, quick. Those are a great way to get some good fats. Are affordable. They're very portable. Nuts and seeds, raw is best. Flax seeds and walnuts really good for a plant source of those omega-3 fats. So flax seeds, just one tidbit though, you want to always grind a flax seed, otherwise it just passes. Is that what you're going to say? Yes.
You skipped on char.
Oh, char, yeah, that's just, the whitefish. Arctic char is a whitefish.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it labeled as Arctic char?
Yeah, it is. Locally, I get no kickback from Whole Foods. I wish I did for the amount of patients I've sent. I don't think they're the end. I don't think they're the end all. I'm not saying they're a perfect store. There's lots of challenges. But in my experience and knowledge, they do a very good job with their fish. That's all I say. They seem to know where it comes from. They have a good market share right now, so they can kind of dictate, I need X of this, and this is how it's going to happen. So it's just aside. There's online things. If anybody has a real, draw, like I really got to get some good fish, there's a couple of nice places you can order fish from as well.
Now, growing up, we used to have to take cod liver oil. Does that mean our mothers knew something?
They actually did. You don't necessarily have to go back and tell them that now if they're still with us. But yeah, there was something to that, yeah. So, when we think of unrefined grains, now grains, we could argue, now there's some question, are grains good for everybody? Some of you may see that sometimes in autoimmune conditions we question, but if you're going to have them, they do have nutrition in them, right? And so we want the whole unrefined grain, because brown rice, as an example, grows as brown rice, and then we harvest it. White rice used to be brown rice, or was, right? So it's that processing. So, and this is where we kind of think, we've talked before about food allergens, and I made a reference to maybe gluten and dairy being our heaviest hitters in that category. Brown rice or quinoa also fall into the category of a gluten-free grain, so for people that may find that to be appropriate, that's a benefit of that. And then legumes, if you tolerate them, beans and legumes are great. They're plant protein, so a half a cup of beans has the same protein as one egg, and lots of fiber, good minerals in them. So that's something you tolerate, that's.
But the egg has all 8 essential amino acids. Does the beans
They're
have
different.
all 8
Yes.
amino acids
They're
essential?
different. They're different than each other, yes. You're correct, they don't.
Okay, so then that would not be a substitute.
It's not a pure substitute, but I don't find too many people who are protein deficient. So probably if people are doing a mix, they're probably going to be covered.
Okay.
Yes.
Is that half a cup cooked?